Rationalist Inhumanism. By Peter Wolfendale. Editor's note. References have been removed for ease of listening. Check the link in the description for the unedited paper. Please enjoy. If the concept of the human has a fundamental feature that remains more or less constant from antiquity to the present day, it is the idea that humanity is something more than one species of animal amongst others. Western culture was founded upon myths that sever us from the animal order, reinforced by their formalization in philosophical and theological accounts of the natural order, and consolidated by their elaboration in classical humanism. This supplement is articulated in various ways within the Western tradition, but it is the perennial picture of man as the rational animal that unites them in distinguishing us from other animals. The traditional role of the humanities has been to preserve and refine the cultural self-understanding that is formed around this picture, supplying both descriptive and normative resources for individual and collective self-determination. However, as Foucault has shown, even though classical humanism wrested the study of human nature from its religious foundations, its understanding of this concept excluded any possibility of a classical science of man. It is the reconfiguration of the human as the object of new human sciences that constitutes the historical break between the classical and modern systems of knowledge. Though the classical rationalism of Descartes understood the world in terms of a knowing subject that had no place within it, it instigated an anthropological turn that, following Kant's critique of reason, implanted this subject in the modern concept of the human, a strange empirico-transcendental doublet. A being such that knowledge will be attained in him of what renders all knowledge possible. The most influential aspect of Foucault's analysis is its conclusion, which suggests that this doublet is coming undone in the same manner as the classical concept of human nature, and foresees that man will be erased, like a face drawn in the sand at the edge of the sea. This prophecy has been borne out by four interacting trends. The natural sciences have progressively undermined the supposed uniqueness of our animality, by isolating empirical study of Homo sapiens from our cultural understanding of the human. 2. The humanities have aggressively critiqued the purported universality of our rationality, by exposing the illicit privileging of masculine, bourgeois, and European forms of life implicit in the association of reason with Western civilization. 3. Technological advancement has begun to compound these theoretical trends, by modifying and even threatening to recreate our cognitive capacities in artificial forms. And 4. Environmental crisis has begun to catalyze the cultural consequences of these other trends, by confronting our societies with the impermanence of the natural order underlying the residual vestiges of the classical worldview. These trends have resulted in the emergence of several strands of posthumanism, which aim to supplant the conceptual foundations of classical humanism and its anthropological variants. Transhumanism is the oldest and most well-developed of these, and is concerned principally with the capacity of emerging technologies to overcome the limitations of the human condition as traditionally conceived. Trend 3. And the normative implications thereof. Critical posthumanism is an attempt to complete the auto-deconstruction of the humanities. Trend 2. By bringing the resources of critical theory and philosophical anti-humanism to bear on the post-human condition as a whole, incorporating trends 3, and 4. It accuses transhumanism of uncritically retaining central elements of classical humanism, including a cache of metaphysical distinctions such as mind/body and culture/nature, and a normative focus on self-determination. By contrast, speculative posthumanism takes the residual humanism of transhumanism to consist in underestimating the possible differences between humans and posthumans indicated by natural science and technological advancement. Trends and 3. Importantly, it rejects the contention that post-human intelligences are bound by the constraints of human rationality. Rationalist inhumanism is an alternative to these positions that attempts to extract the normative core of humanism from its imbrication with the biological and historical contingencies of the human species, confronting trends and 2, so as to explicitly articulate and defend aspects of the residual humanism that critical and speculative posthumanism locate in transhumanism. It does this by exploring the connection between the explanatory programs of Kantian critique and artificial general intelligence, AGI, on the one hand, embracing trend 3, and rejecting the theological equilibrium presupposed by every normative appeal to nature, on the other, embracing trend 4. Its rationalism lies in its affirmation of those features of humanism that are consequences of the idea that humans are defined by the capacity for rational agency. It understands the functional distinction between animal sentience and human sapience in terms of the difference between reliable differential response, for example, uttering X is red in the presence of red things, and conceptual competence, for example, understanding that X is red implies X is not green, or the capacity to engage in discursive practices more generally, and it understands the normative rift between nature and culture in terms of autonomy, or the capacity for individual and collective self-determination. Its inhumanism lies in its rejection of those features of humanism that are consequences of indexing these capacities to the biology, psychology, and cultural history of Homo sapiens. It sees reason as an abstract protocol that has been functionally implemented by the techno-linguistic infrastructure of human culture, and it sees freedom as an insurrectionary force that has bootstrapped itself out of evolutionary pre-adaptations and reformatted the human species as a suitable processing platform. It is this attempt to locate an alien vector within humanism which pushes it beyond itself that calls for the prefix in rather than anti, post, or even trans. It is worth examining how Nagoristani invokes Foucault in order to describe this dynamic, a universal wave that erases the self-portrait of man drawn in sand. Inhumanism is a vector of revision. It relentlessly revises what it means to be human by removing its supposedly self-evident characteristics while preserving certain invariances. Insofar as the concept of the human articulates our cultural self-understanding, it is not merely subject to passive change, as we have seen in the transitions between pre-classical, classical, and modern eras, but open to active revision in accordance with the norm of collective self-determination. Inhumanism turns humanism's commitment to self-determination upon itself by elaborating the consequences of this radical revisability. The theoretical consequence is the dissection of the empirico-transcendental doublet and a renewed transcendentalism, rejecting not only psychologism and historicism, but all concrete forms of the anthropological prejudice. We attempt to question afresh the limits of thought, and to renew contact in this way with the project for a general critique of reason. The invariances that cannot be revised in the process of self-determination are precisely the conditions of possibility of revision and self-determination themselves. This dissection of man extracts the universal subject of classical rationalism from its empirical cladding, flaying the masculine, bourgeois, and European specificities hidden behind its supposed otherworldliness from its abstract operational form, and leaving nothing but a set of functions that can be realized in diverse material substrates and divergent forms of life. Humans, animals, aliens, and machines alike can adopt the role of sapient subjects and autonomous agents, so long as they possess the corresponding capacities. The connection between Kantian critique and Augy lies in their concern with providing the most minimal description of these capacities, a functional diagram of what something would have to do to be generally capable of thought and action. The practical consequence is a form of Prometheanism commensurate with transhumanism, the project of re-engineering ourselves and our world on a more rational basis. If inhumanism treats supposedly self-evident characteristics of humanity, such as vocational sociality, dimorphic sexuality, or terrestrial domesticity, as conceptual determinations to be discarded in searching for minimal conditions for abstract autonomy, then Prometheanism treats these same characteristics as empirical obstacles to be surmounted in achieving maximal conditions for concrete freedom. There are distinct Promethean projects concerned with each obstacle just mentioned. Accelerationism strives to turn the emancipatory tendencies of modernity against the oppressive sociality of capitalism. Xenofeminism aims to harness the artificiality of identity by rejecting the givenness of material conditions, sex, and social forms, gender, alike, and cosmism enjoins us to consider the earth a trap, treating gravity as one more constraint to be overcome by the generalized escapology of design. The inhumanism of these projects lies in their embrace of alienation as a positive force, transforming our progressive exile from a series of Edenic harmonies, be they economic, sociological, or environmental, into an esoteric genealogy of freedom. Ultimately, what differentiates critical and speculative posthumanism from rationalist inhumanism is that they overcome man by renewing metaphysics rather than transcendentalism. Critical posthumanism collapses the distinction between human and non-human by positing a universal vitality, Zoe, in which both partake, whereas speculative posthumanism articulates the disconnect between human and post-human by positing a category of functionally autonomous assemblages to which both belong. The choice between these paths can be framed in terms of the perennial picture from which we began. Do we unbind animality from the normative constraints of rationality, or unbind rationality from the metaphysical constraints of animality?